Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Omar. I live in Belgium, and currently I am serving as the secretary of the Dutch-Flemish chapter of Isaac. This video is a re-recording of my presentation about Pseudobulbar Affect that I had the honor of giving on the Communication Matters Conference in Leeds, UK, in September 2025. Before I start with the presentation, I want to let you know that this voice is not the one I typically use in the real world with my AAC device. This voice should be multilingual and therefore ensure that I can use the same voice for the Dutch version of this video. I had the honor to present to you all about the Pseudobulbar Affect and how this can affect a person, specifically who is using an AAC solution to communicate. I also wanted to explore more generally how AAC users experience their emotions versus how other people understand the emotions of AAC users. So this presentation will be a bit broader than only PBA. But I also want to stress that the contents of this presentation consist mainly of my own view and experiences on the matter. I would love to hear your experiences in the comments. It is always a good idea to first define what we are talking about. Before we do that, however, I want to stress that while I did my best to research this topic, I'm mainly an expert by experience. So the following definition may be not complete. Pseudobulbar affect is a neurological condition that can cause sudden, uncontrollable laughter or crying without actually feeling happy or sad. It occurs as a secondary condition from other neurological conditions such as ALS, MS, a traumatic brain injury, and cerebral palsy, of course, among other conditions. Today I'm going to focus on the experiences of a couple of my friends who have CP, as well as on my own experiences. So this presentation will possibly not provide enough variety to get a full picture. As I mentioned already, PBA causes sudden and unintentional outbursts of emotions. This can be crying, laughing, and/or other emotional outbursts. This is often due to lesions in the parts of the brain that are responsible for emotional expressions and control, such as the prefrontal cortex or the thalamus. The important thing to know is that these emotional outbursts do not reflect the actual emotional state of the person. For example, a person with PBA may start to cry even when there's nothing that saddens them, so when there's no trigger at all. It is also possible that there may be a trigger causing the outburst, but that the emotional outburst is not proportional to the trigger. PBA can have various negative effects on the person. Due to the emotional outbursts that don't match the situation, or at least because it gets perceived that way by other people, the person with PBA can be embarrassed when the outbursts occur. It even can lead to social isolation. Partly due to this, PBA can get misdiagnosed pretty easily, with psychological conditions such as depression or bipolar disorder. PBA is underdiagnosed too due to unawareness of this condition by both the clinicians and the patients themselves. Before we delve deeper into this topic, I want to explain briefly why I chose this topic in particular. Because there are many interesting topics that are worth presenting, of course, one of the big ones is, in my opinion, the implementation of AI in AAC systems, or maybe a more general look of the evolution of AAC tech, to name a few. But what most of these topics have in common is that they already are being discussed, as far as I observe at least, but I feel this is not the case with PBA or for emotions of AAC users more generally. A quick search on what got published in the AAC journal confirms this actually. While there are dozens of articles published about AI, there were no articles at all published about PBA. Searching with the keyword emotion yielded much more results. More than 300 articles were found that were published in the AAC journal. But after I skimmed over most of them, with which I mean looked at the title and sometimes read the abstract, if the title indicated relevance, I came to the conclusion that only a couple of those 300 articles were about exploring the emotions of AAC users. The majority of those 300 articles contained the keyword emotion to indicate that expressing emotions is a benefit of having an AAC solution. This is true, of course, but this was not the topic that I was looking for. Again, I do not want to undermine the importance of research about AI, but in my opinion, the emotional expressions of people who use AAC are also worth our attention because it can have a genuine effect on AAC users, as we're going to explore today. One important source that I could find thanks to people on the CMAAC forum on Google Groups is one article by Katie Carrier and Christine Sherlock that was published on the CM Journal in 2012. This article titled, "When Feelings Get Too Much, Athetoid Cerebral Palsy, Emotions, and AAC," was an invaluable starting point for doing research for this presentation because they were asking essentially the same core question that I was. I heard of PBA less than a year ago, and only because one of my fellow AAC users stumbled upon it on the internet when he was searching for an explanation of his behavior. On a given day, he asked me if I ever laugh at inappropriate moments. This question sparked hours-long conversations. I like to give him the word through this short video, which he made all by himself for you, by the way. He was very proud of that. Let's listen what he has to say.
Hallo, ik ben Reinier. Ik ben 45 jaar, ben spastisch en ik kan niet verbaal communiceren. Ik ga het hebben over onbedoelde emoties. Onbedoelde emoties komen meestal spontaan op, doordat ik iets zie of merk dat ik in eerste instantie als grappig ervaar, terwijl het in werkelijkheid helemaal niet grappig is. Omdat ik dus niet kan praten, ga ik lachen. Ik zal jullie een voorbeeld geven wat echt gebeurd is. Ik lag in bed om me klaar te laten maken voor de nacht. Mijn condoomkatheter ging er heel moeilijk af, en toen hij er uiteindelijk afging, kwam er een beetje urine uit mijn penis, zo over de hand van de verzorgende, waarop ik uit de reflex ging lachen. De verzorgende was daar echter niet van gediend en die liet er niet bij zitten. Zij is de volgende dag naar haar leidinggevende gegaan en heeft haar verhaal gemeld, waarop ik op gesprek moest komen met die verzorgende en met de leidinggevende. Ondertussen ben ik op internet gaan speuren naar wat ik heb. Het blijkt dat ik een vorm van PBA heb. En ik heb dat ook in het gesprek gezegd, dat ik daar echt niets aan kan doen. Ik heb hem gelukkig wel weten te overtuigen dat het lachen bij mij iets heel anders kan betekenen dan het voor de meeste mensen geldt. Bij mij betekent het meer van steun betuigen. Kijk, als je helemaal niet kan praten, dan zijn dit soort dingen extra moeilijk. Dit wilde ik graag met jullie delen. Groetjes, Reinier.
A particular interesting point he makes is that laughing for him is a way to express understanding or empathy for someone. When I asked him further questions on this, he gave the example of someone accidentally stumping their toe. In this situation, Renier will probably laugh to ask if the person is okay. When I thought about this, it made sense for me personally, because lots of people will laugh themselves when they stump their toe. They don't laugh because they experience pain, they laugh at the situation or at their own stupidity, if I may put it that way. So acknowledging this, suddenly Renier, laughing in these sorts of situations becomes much more understandable, I feel. After I heard what occurred, I was filled with indignation and realized that this needed to be brought into attention. I would be bothered much less about what Renier told me if the person who was ignorant was someone random on the street. But this was not the case. It was a healthcare professional who was ignorant, someone who's supposed to be educated on how to act around people with disabilities. Maybe it is a bit ineffective to do a presentation here in the UK while the problem occurred in the Netherlands, but whilst I do not have concrete evidence, I fear that this ignorance about PBA or how AAC users express emotions in a more general sense may be not limited to only the Netherlands. I feel that it is warranted to say a few words about self-diagnosing. Self-diagnosis is not something that I would recommend anyone to do for any serious symptoms, as an attempt to find a remedy. Instead of this, I highly recommend seeing a healthcare professional if you are having symptoms of any kind. While I mention PBA a lot in this presentation, I merely do this because the experience of someone with PBA are very similar to what I feel and what other people that I have talked to told me how they feel. It is maybe interesting to provide a brief overview on my own AAC journey. I have cerebral palsy due to my brain suffering from hypoxia during birth. As a toddler, prior to having an AAC device, I mainly communicated by gesturing iconic gestures and pointing at relevant things. These iconic gestures developed naturally throughout my childhood. For example, when I wanted to go to sleep, I squinted my eyes shut. These iconic gestures are only iconic for the people that knew me well, as you might imagine. These gestures were not iconic at all for people who didn't know me very well, or for complete strangers. These people didn't know where the gesture came from to begin with, and it was sometimes not easy for them to differentiate between my intended gestures and the random movements of my limbs and head. Sometimes it was even difficult for them to see when I was nodding. In these cases, I remember that a lot of people would ask me to smile to them, if I wanted to say yes. It is interesting for me to note that many different people came up with the same tactic to be able to communicate with me. As I grew older and began to go to a school for children with special needs, we started looking into better ways to communicate. To help me communicate easier and to provide me with a broader vocabulary, my speech and language pathologist made a physical folder full of symbols on pages. Every page within this folder had a theme and contained symbols about that theme. I gained more agency in what I could communicate about when I learned to read and write. Once that I could read, I could spell keywords to convey my message, rather than being limited to the options in my talkbook. My SLP created for me a letterboard. My communication partner would point the letters, and I confirmed that they were on the right letter by nodding. This was time-consuming, as you can imagine, but that was the first time I had complete agency in what I could say. I was lucky to have a passionate team around me at school that was willing to look for the right solutions for me. At the time I was learning to read, we were also looking for a way for me to control a powered wheelchair. After trying a bunch of other things, they realized that I had some control in my right foot. After this very important realization, I began to train to control the mouse of a PC with a joystick. Meanwhile, the people at school that are responsible for the assistive equipment of the pupils adjusted an old wheelchair in such a way that I could control it with my foot. After I think 1 year of training intensively, I was finally proficient enough in controlling the old wheelchair and began the very long process of applying for my own wheelchair. Having my own powered wheelchair was a big step forward towards gaining independence, as I could move independently now. But there was another big advantage of my new wheelchair. With it, I had the ability to control any PC. Being able to control a PC was a crucial step towards gaining independence, because we could mount a speech-generating device on my wheelchair with which I could communicate freely. After applying and waiting 20 long months, I finally received my AAC device at the age of 10. Being able to communicate independently and having full agency over the content of my messages was a very important turning point in my life. Now, since 2018, I switched from my right foot to eye gaze for controlling my speech-generating device. This sped up my typing rate to up to 20 words per minute, whilst requiring less energy. We shall turn our attention back to the matter at hand: emotional expressions. When I was a child, teachers and other people that worked with me at school described me often as a boy that loves to laugh, or the boy that is always smiling, and you can say that I never grew out of it. I remember that I would be embarrassed as a teenager when I overreacted to something. This happened frequently when I went to see a movie or a play. The latter was more problematic because the ambient sound of a play is usually low enough that noises from the public can be heard during a play. On one occasion, the actors broke the fourth wall to make a remark of my yelling. I was embarrassed, of course. In those moments, I yell because I am very invested in the story, I think. To be honest with you, it is difficult to me to discern exactly how much of that emotional outburst is real or fake. What I can say for certain is that I definitely feel some of those expressed emotions, as it always happens after a trigger. Another moment these emotional outbursts occur is when I listen to a presentation and when the presenter says something mildly funny. While this can make the average listener smile, I might yell out of happiness. And this is also interesting to mention. I rarely laugh unintentionally. It is mostly yelling out of happiness. I think that is why I find it difficult to discern how much of that is my genuine emotion. You can feel happiness all day, while finding something funny and laughing at it is mostly a very short occurrence. But luckily, I was never too embarrassed where I wouldn't want to go somewhere public. And as I grew older, it was easier to accept that this is who I am and that I shouldn't be embarrassed for who I am. Throughout the years, I have developed simple methods to subdue the emotional outbursts. I can't feel the first outburst is coming up. It happens very suddenly. But often when the first outburst occurs, other outbursts are likely to follow. To subdue secondary outbursts, I may focus on something else, like on the feeling of my footrest when I put my feet on it, or pressure of my seat on my back. Sometimes it also helps to be aware of how other people are reacting. Other times I try to realize that the upcoming secondary outbursts are not my genuine reactions. So in short, I try to focus on something other than the speaker. These methods have a varying success rate. Sometimes I am able to subdue the outbursts, other times not. Because the central theme of this conference is identity, I believe that it is interesting to delve a bit deeper into the question if and on what level my identity is defined by my emotional outbursts and therefore my disability. A good way to begin is by defining the term identity, I believe. In my mind, identity is the collection of personal aspects a person uses to either connect with others or distinguish themselves. If I use that definition and ask myself if I see my disability as an aspect that distinguishes me from non-disabled people or connects me with other people with disabilities, the answer for me personally is yes. When I see an unknown person in a wheelchair on the street, I definitely feel that we are connected in some shape or form. But my disability is of course not the sole aspect that defines me. I am a Muslim. I am Belgian with Turkish roots. I am a gamer, a writer, and so much more. Some aspects contribute more, others contribute less, but all of these aspects contribute to my identity. Sadly, there is a common misbelief in society that says that we are only defined by our disabilities. This misbelief results in prejudices like we have a sad and miserable life. This is also the reason why people don't seem to see us as equals. This is going to be slightly off topic maybe, but it is an important point to make. One of the most important reasons why we fail to root out these misbeliefs is that we, as in disabled people, are often not represented correctly in the media. If a disabled person does make it on TV, which is rare by itself, it is predominantly for one of two reasons. The person appears in the media either thanks to their disability, to highlight what a miserable life he got, or they appear in the media in spite of their disability, to highlight what they have achieved. While it may seem that these two reasons are the opposite from each other, this is not the case because both of them has the disability of the person at its core. I think that it is clear why it is bad to solely focus on the disability of the person. This fuels the impression that disabled people have miserable lives for whom the society should feel pity. But why could it be bad when the media focuses on the achievements of people with disabilities? The reason is similar actually. By focusing on what the person has achieved in spite of their disability, the narrative becomes that having a disability is inherently something bad, and that people should be inspired by what the person has achieved. I have experienced this firsthand actually. For years I had been writing my book, and in 2022 we were going to publish it. In short, in my book, I wrote about my thoughts and experiences as a Muslim with cerebral palsy. The publisher I worked with asked me to reach out to the media to promote my book. After a few emails, I got interviewed by our local newspaper, which was very exciting. The publishing date was less than ideal. They had published the article months before people could read my book, but in general, it was a relatively good article, I thought. Here follows a short extract from that article. His book is titled My Right Foot. In it, Omar writes about how society often views people with disabilities and how many prejudices still exist. I often notice people looking at me as if I were a small child who needs pity, says Omar. End of extract. About 8 hours after the publishing of this article, I received the following email. I am deeply impressed by your life story. Give me your bank account number and I will transfer a modest contribution to make my appreciation concrete. With all my sympathy. Sun emoji. Tony, sent from my iPad. I was baffled by this email to say the least. Tony obviously did not have any nefarious intentions, I believe, but it was still pretty much the opposite takeaway that I wanted people would have after reading that article. I very politely declined his offer and indicated that it would be more than enough to read my book to make his appreciation concrete. To conclude this subtopic, I do want to make clear that I do not advocate to never have a story in the media that's about the disability of a person or about the achievements of people with disabilities. But it is crucial to have stories that presents the person in question as a full-fledged person instead of only focusing on their disability. Like, why not cast a person with a disability for a random role in a movie instead of only casting them when the scenario calls for a disabled person? Anyway, I have drifted off topic quite a bit. My apologies. Let's refocus. So I have said that I personally see my disability as a part of my identity. And because I see my emotional outbursts as a part of my disability, I can conclude that I see those outbursts as a part of my identity too. This lines up with how other people who are close to me think about this topic. When I told my mother that I was planning a presentation about this, she said that she too saw these outbursts as a part of me, and that it wasn't a bad thing to have these outbursts. Those emotional outbursts show who you are, she said. I believe that a very big factor of why I see these emotional outbursts as a part of me is because CP is a congenital condition. I always had these outbursts, from birth on. It is, I think, for this reason that I've never given much thought about what caused these emotional conditions. I was embarrassed at times, of course, certainly when this happened in public, but I rarely felt the urge to discuss it with someone. The fact that no one who was close to me made a problem of it was a huge factor, I believe. Last July, I had my annual checkup at a hospital that specializes in CP. As I was preparing for this presentation at the time, I asked the psychotherapist there if they ever inform their patients preemptively about PBA. She told me no. In most cases, the patient, or those who are around them, tell them about their emotional outbursts first, and then they can proceed to possibly diagnose the patient with PBA. It is conceivable that people with non-congenital conditions, such as a traumatic brain injury or ALS, are way more likely to discuss their unintended emotional outbursts with a healthcare professional, as this would be something new for them. But those with congenital conditions such as CP are way less likely to discuss this because they have these outbursts from birth, if these outbursts are not extreme, and if the people close to the person don't make a problem of it. At first, right after I heard the story of my friend Renier, I was of the opinion that people with congenital conditions should be made aware of PBA. But when I think about it a bit now, I don't know for sure. I think that I would have found it very weird if in my teens someone told me, out of the blue, Omar, you know that yelling that you are doing sometimes, those might be a sign of a neurological condition called PBA. I do not say that this would have been a bad thing. I think that I would have appreciated it in due time, as that would be another reason to not be embarrassed. But I certainly can understand that this would have been an awkward conversation. The people who are close to me don't seem to be bothered by my emotional outbursts. They know me well enough to know that these outbursts are only but a small part of me. But this is not the case for random people on the street. While I have never encountered someone who explicitly said it, I do often feel that strangers think that I have a lower cognitive capacity than it is actually the case. I think this is due to multiple factors. I sit in a wheelchair, my arms flail around uncontrollably. That's sometimes reason enough. I believe that another big factor is that I can't immediately respond to their questions. When they ask me a question, and I seem to focus on the screen in front of me instead of answering their query, they simply conclude that I'm not being able to understand them. And if I happen to yell to something insignificant, that further cements their misbelief. I try to empathize with those people. When I would see someone who is laughing seemingly at nothing, maybe I would also think that this person is cognitively challenged. But the fact that I understand them doesn't make it less annoying, though. This was an overview of how I see my own emotional expressions. But to provide you a bit broader perspective than just that of my own, I've talked to a few of my friends who use an AAC solution themselves to also provide their perspective on this topic. One of the first individuals I interviewed is my oldest friend, Charlotte. Me and her go way back, almost 25 years ago, when we started together to go to kindergarten. Charlotte has also cerebral palsy. She had previously a speech-generating device, but in recent years she prefers to communicate without her device. When we were talking about this topic, she shared the following interesting anecdote. Charlotte goes to a day center for people with disabilities, and on one given day she goes on a walk with her aide. On that walk she encountered a stranger who starts hugging her suddenly. Although she very much did not like her personal space being invaded, she smiles. She explained that she wanted to be friendly, and also that the stranger herself smiled. Both factors may contributed Charlotte to smile. But because she smiled, she could not make it clear that she didn't want to be held. Luckily, her aide intervened quickly and helped Charlotte explain that she didn't appreciate her personal space being invaded. She added that people close to her can see accurately if she's happy or sad, but that this is difficult for strangers to judge. After Charlotte, I've talked with my dear friend, Youssef. Due to complications during hospitalization at the age of 12, he suffered brain damage, and as a result, he now uses a wheelchair, and he communicates with a speech-generating device. I explained briefly what my presentation was going to be about, and he told me that he recognizes himself in what I had told him. He explained that he always seems to laugh, even when that was a little bit uncalled for. He recalled that he once laughed at a small child who was pestering her mother. When I asked him if other people ever took issue of him because of this, he said no. He told me that people generally are finding it awesome that he always laughs, even if they know too little about me, he added. I thought that he implied that he didn't like that other people thought about him that way, but when I asked that to him to confirm, he told me that he really did not care what other people thought. He concluded that him laughing is a part of who he is. The last person that I spoke to is a young woman and also my friend, named Litania. She has cerebral palsy too, and she communicates with an eye gaze-enabled AAC device. Her take on this topic was pretty similar to that of Youssef, actually. After I explained the premise of this presentation, she told me that she sometimes experiences unintended outbursts of laughing too, particularly when she is thinking about something funny. Just like Youssef, she expressed that she did not care whatsoever about what other people think about her in that moment. She said the following: I am Litania, and I don't care about the rest. My friends and family understand my emotions, and the rest should accept me as I am. After I had finished presenting, and we went over to the questions the listeners had, someone shared their experience as a nurse who worked with people who had suffered from brain trauma. Her perspective differed from my experiences, and therefore I wanted to include that. She told that when a patient who had a traumatic brain injury, and this person was crying, other colleagues would often conclude very quickly that the crying is a result of the brain injury and therefore could be ignored. The listener expressed that she is not comfortable in ignoring the crying of the patient, and she asked me how she needed to react in these kinds of situations. I answered plainly that they could ask the patient if their current emotional outbursts are the result of what they really feel, or the result of something like PBA. I wanted to share this to reiterate that others have different experiences than me. This is the end of my presentation. I hope my presentation provided an added value to help shed more light on this underexposed topic. I firstly want to thank Renier, Charlotte, Youssef, and Litania for sharing their views. I also want to thank Communication Matters, of course, for organizing this valuable conference and for giving me and other AAC users in general a platform from where we can share our stories and bring topics that are relevant to us into attention. And last but definitely not least, I want to thank all of you for your attention.